Hey everybody, this is Stephen Feuerstein, developer advocate for Oracle Database, here to welcome you to our latest SQL Office Hours session. And wow, do we have a show for you today. So the topic is database triggers. You say stop, I say go. And it's an exploration into database triggers and why you should use them, why you shouldn't use them, disagreements about either of those two approaches. And we're gonna have a couple of extra speakers on with us today besides myself. We've got Chris Saxon, we've got Toon Koppelaars,
hey guys.
Jacek Gabel of the utPLSQL team, and Toon is from the Real World Performance team. So you've got lots of ways to contact us online, as you can see on this.
Hi guys.
Jacek. And so what we're going to do is talk about database triggers. So in terms of AskTOM Office Hours, let me just take a quick ping over to our SQL Office Hours website. You've probably been here before, but if not, please make sure to subscribe. That way you'll get reminders of the session. And also if you come back to this session later, and there are many sessions you can go back to later, and you can find out a lot more about SQL. Each one has a recording, go exploring. But on each one of these pages, you'll find also links to resources. So at the bottom of this page, for example, you won't see expert tools, that's just for me. You'll see a number of links specific to database triggers, including the slides for this talk today, including Toon's blog posts on the series, and so on. So use this site going forward, this page going forward, as a little resource center if you want to find out more about database triggers besides watching the video. Okay, so diving in, database triggers. As you're about to hear, some people say things like, you should never use triggers. Some people hate using the word never and want to find some sort of way to, give you some more perhaps workable or practical advice. And we're going to talk about today. So as I said, we're going to hear from Toon. We're going to hear from Jacek, actually Jacek up next after me. Chris Saxon will also pitch in his ideas. But as important as all of that is for you to let us know what you think from your experience with triggers and your guidance that you'd like to offer. Now, what I'm not going to do in this session is give you some sort of deep dive on database triggers. I'm going to assume a basic level of knowledge, but a couple of overriding comments. So broadly speaking, inside Oracle Database, there are two types of triggers. One are system triggers. They could be database event triggers, like after you log on, take these actions. They could be DDL triggers, like on creation of a table, do X. And then there are DML triggers, triggers on tables and views. There could be simple triggers, compound triggers, and set of triggers. Now here's an example of a system trigger. So I'm creating a trigger that basically says, look, I don't want anybody to be able to drop objects on the HR schema. No way. Once they're in place, it's production, whatever else, you can't mess with it. And this, we're going to just accept generally for the conversation today, system triggers are A-OK. You're going to build the ones you need, and of course you could screw it up. You could create a logon trigger that fails, and then nobody can log in. But we'll assume that you're basically handling your database the way you need to manage it with your system triggers. What we're going to be focusing on this session are the DML triggers, triggers created on tables and views. Those are the triggers that tend to be the source of controversy, giving us lots of fun things to talk about, and also likely to have the most impact on your production applications. So what I'd like to do now is introduce Jacek Gebal, who works for Fidelity and also is one of the main people behind utPLSQL version 3, a major renaissance for automated testing in the PLSQL environment. And he had some comments that I thought would be great to share at the beginning of this session. And then we're going to get into details from Toon, look at examples, get your explicit feedback, and go from there. So Jacek, please go right ahead. And if you'd like to, I can stop sharing. If you'd like to just speak to all of us with a nice big header, I can leave it like this. Up to you.
I think you can leave it like that. I
Okay.
have nothing to share from my side. So,
okay.
Yeah, as you mentioned in the slide, triggers are great. They've been there for a very long time, and they have been invented and created and added to Oracle database for a reason. They actually, when you think about it from a high-level view, they actually allow you to react to events happening on your data tables. So like, inserting a data row or deleting a row. If you want to think of triggers as mechanisms to react to an event, that's a perfect solution. And it also allows you to separate the concerns. So let's say you have a big project with a huge code base that is responsible for doing one thing, but then aside from that, you want to have something separate that will just plug into the project. And that way you can use triggers to plug into your data points to react to certain changes to the data happening in your database. And of course, I've seen projects where everything was built on triggers. So there was no logic in the SQL that would go from one point to another.
Mm-hmm.
And navigating through the code base was a nightmare, because really figuring out what's going on in the system and how the data flows through the system, what are the dependencies, was almost impossible, because you just went from one procedure to a trigger, to another procedure, then to another table, then another trigger, and it was just a nightmare. So of course, there are situations where using triggers will give you a headache or will give you serious problems. I won't even mention the performance. I guess Toon will talk about it a lot. But I see very good use cases for triggers in real life.
Thanks, Jacek. And one question: when you saw that nightmare of a situation where basically the entire application was buried in triggers, were you able to do some untangling there, or was that pretty much stuck in place as is, and you just had to deal with it?
That was just as is. I came to the project to see how can the performance be improved, because they were struggling with performance. And my only, and I had like a day to get familiar with the system, which was already built by 50 engineers. So it was just impossible even to navigate and understand where the performance bottlenecks are, because they were just everywhere.
Okay. All right, great. So thanks for those overall comments and your experience. We just had a question come in on the chat, so I'll go ahead and read that, and we can see if anybody would like to respond. Can someone recall why Oracle created triggers? Someone I remember, it is Oracle's response to IBM, because they had some kind of trigger solution.
Or Sybase.
Or Sybase, yeah.
Sybase had triggers in those days, and we didn't yet.
So Sybase got triggers before Oracle did. Okay. And I actually worked at Oracle when Sybase first started to get really big and scary. It was pretty much the first time that I think Oracle felt actually scared about a competitor. And so maybe then we just said, oh my God, triggers, we need triggers. But I think that's probably about it for history. Any other thoughts from the distant past?
Well, this is in this distant past, the thing conformance to certain SQL NG ISO standard levels was big in those days. And if you didn't have stored procedures or triggers, you weren't conforming to a certain level of the NG ISO SQL standard. And we were behind in those days, which is why we caught up with Oracle 7. And we also introduced triggers, because it's just in the SQL standard. It's not an Oracle thing.
All right, great. Thanks, Toon. And I have now moved on to the next slide, which is to basically hand over the session to Toon, who's going to speak for the next 45 minutes. And no. But you're going to give us a nice overview, and you go over your concerns.
Let me. So 10 years ago, I wrote a blog on blogspot.com. It's called "Triggers Considered Harmful, Considered Harmful," and on that blog, I wanted to give a little bit of a more, let's call it, objective view on this whole trigger topic.
Balanced.
Because you can move on to the next slide now, Stephen. In those days, we had a very big influencer. I think the word influencer wasn't hip back then, but it is now.
He was a thought leader.
Yeah, he was a thought leader. So Thomas Kite. I mean, I think most of the people on the call will know who he is. And he's written a lot on AskTOM back then, but also on his personal blog, which is still available on the web archive. Not if you type this in your URL, where he says triggers are so abused and so inappropriately, I'd rather live without them. Or the bottom one, why doesn't he like triggers? Because I hate being surprised and tricked. And trickery is all about, and triggers are all about trickery and surprises. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But he was of course, he went to a lot of user groups. He published a lot in the Oracle magazine and on the internet. He was a thought leader. He was an influencer, and he gave rise to, next slide, please, Stephen, the fact that so his legacy is that at the moment, or back then, the default response at any question anywhere popping up on the internet related to triggers was avoid them as much as possible. Don't use them. They're bad. Triggers are considered harmful, without any further explanation. Yeah,
Mhm.
that was status quo, I think, at some point, and maybe in certain areas within the Oracle community, that's still the pervasive opinion out there.
Well, I can
So on the
certainly tell you that when people get an idea in their head, it doesn't matter if, every single blog post since then has corrected that. It sticks in their head. For example, never use implicit cursors, always use explicit cursors.
yeah, that's
Something
another
we talked about in like 1989, and I
Yes.
still ran into that. So yes, it's very hard to erase those extreme positions. Okay.
Yeah. So let me just, and I have now just 4 slides to give a more objective view on this whole trigger area. So what I see a lot, what I've seen as the main use cases for database triggers is, and I'm sure you will recognize them, is one, modify new columns, typically in row insert triggers. I'll have a slide on that after this. Execute changes outside the transaction. I'll explain that also in a minute. Or execute changes inside the transaction, and I think this is what the person talking before me was just talking about. Sorry, I forgot your first name.
Jacek.
Jacek was talking about where one insert triggers an insert trigger which does more, etc., triggering even more triggers. And a fourth use case was always querying tables. So let's look at each of these 4 real short. Yeah. So typically, you'd see things like this inside row trigger bodies. New.created equals sysdate, new.creator equals user. Back in the client server area, you could do that. Nowadays, you'd have to do something rather more sophisticated, or automatically set a sequence.next file on an ID primary key column. Yeah, and to me, this is already something that I would question whether you really want to do that. Because what happens if I supply these column values? They simply get overwritten. Okay, you say, well, I can have an if clause in my row trigger. I check if the value is supplied, and if it's not supplied, I just add these columns. Well, to me, the benefit of writing these row triggers is very little. Yeah, maybe an application error would be more appropriate if you overwrite a value that's already supplied. I don't know. Next slide, please. The other use case, and this is one where Tom Kite also published a few blogs about, also in relation to the automatic restart of DML statements due to some sort of consistency issue that may happen inside the database, is where you execute things inside your triggers that actually do make changes somewhere, but they are not bound to the transactional control mechanism of your Oracle transaction. Yeah? So if you call a REST service, or back then if you called a SOAP service, that actually did something at the endpoint of that REST or SOAP service, but then later on you rolled back your transaction, the REST or SOAP service change is already persisted on the other side. Yeah? Same thing with sending an email, and sending an email via the supplied package is once you've called sending an email, it's done. You can't roll back sending an email or writing a file. Executing autonomous transactions is another example. Yeah. So all of the above is outside your transaction and irreversible. So if you do a rollback, they can't be rolled back. Yeah. So that's an issue with doing these kinds of things inside triggers. Typically, bad practice to do that, in my opinion. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is the maintenance nightmare scenario where triggers execute changes that are part of my transaction. So you cascade more DML statements, you execute more DML statements inside your trigger bodies, which change other tables, which maybe also have triggers, which even cause even further stuff to happen inside those cascading triggers that also fire as part of your single row insert or update that started this whole trigger firing in the first place. Yeah. So the issue that I have with this one is that the semantics, the well understood semantics of SQL insert, SQL update, or SQL delete, you just change these semantics. Yeah. And you may know you've created this trigger on this table, and you know that when you do an insert, I know I have different semantics, not just this row is created, but also these other DMLs fire, which do a whole lot of other stuff in other tables in my database. But people arriving at the scene and maintaining your code, because you built an application, what, in 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, and then the application stays alive for 20 or even 3 decades, 20 years or 30 years, they are not aware of these triggers being there. Yeah? Sometimes you may have future use cases where you want to do insert, update, or delete, but you don't want the side effects of these triggers. Yeah? So you then have to be sure that you disable them first, or make changes into these triggers that otherwise they don't have those side effects given some sort of condition. So this is the maintenance nightmare, and this is also the trickery and surprises that Tom Kite talks about.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a fourth use case, and that's where the triggers don't have the non-transactional stuff, they don't have the DML stuff, but they just have queries. Just queries. And they typically have queries to mandate some kind of cross-row constraint. It's a very common use case you've seen in people using triggers to basically enforce constraints that you can't declare declaratively. Yeah. I have an example that I have up here. Maybe you only allow one president in the employees table. Well, you build an insert trigger, right? That checks the count star of the employees whose job is president. And if it's more than one, you do a raise application error. Of course, you have to fix the infamous mutating table error, and you have to also think about serialization. That's already going probably a bridge too far for a lot of people who have used this triggers for this use case. But it's actually very complex. It can get very complex very fast if you use triggers to just query the triggering table or other tables to enforce cross-row constraints. And this is actually why I'm a big evangelist inside Oracle of us providing SQL assertions. Because SQL assertions will enable you to just declaratively do all these other constraints also, and thereby not requiring you to build triggers anymore. Yeah. So in summary, next slide, please, Stephen. So the first 3 use cases being indeed surprisery and trickery. All kinds of side effects that you may not be aware of when you do an insert, update, or delete and a trigger fires. And the last one is actually too complex to do it right. I've seen implementations where people try to implement additional constraints via queries on tables inside triggers, and it's actually A, maybe not the most efficient way, and B, it doesn't cover all the cases. And with that, I leave the floor to the others at the moment. So this is my viewpoint on this whole trigger arena.
Thank you, Toon. Okay, so what I've got in the next couple of slides that you were seeing, because I was trying to type into the chat window and it kept, whatever, technology befuddles me. We're going to take a look at examples of a few different triggers and get your feedback on them. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is kind of step through some of the chat messages and answer questions, or just pretty much add to the recording what people have been saying. So there were some comments about SQL Forms triggers. In fact, yes, there were triggers in a database product before there were database triggers. So if any of you are familiar with SQL Forms 2.3, and I suppose beyond as well, there were SQL Forms triggers that were really interesting and could be very complicated, but they're separate from database triggers. We use triggers, but is there a way to control the order in which a series of triggers fire against a table? Great question. Historically, there had not been a way to do that, but starting, I think, in 11G Release 2, you can now add the follows clause onto a DML trigger, and you could say that this trigger must follow another trigger, but only within the same event. So if I have, historically and famously, if I had 6 different triggers all on before update for a row on employees, you could not guarantee the order of the firing at all, which of course caused some issues for people. There are a couple of ways you deal with that now. One is you can have the follows syntax. The other is that you can use a compound trigger that allows you to put all of your code together in a single, essentially kind of like a trigger package, and that will help you manage your complex trigger logic. We had to log the versions of records for a particular row. We created an after update trigger with bind variables for old to another table. So my question here is this the right approach, or is there another way? And this is something that Toon had already mentioned in terms of auditing changes. And Chris is going to go into this in a lot more detail.
Yeah, right, Chris? We'll talk about this in, once we've gone through these, I'll talk about this and a bit more, yeah.
Yep. Control order, got that. In some cases, I think there could be a good use for database triggers, but conversely, if you have a database that people can access through ODBC or similar means, you may want to seriously consider table triggers to track data changes that wouldn't be captured by your normal applications. Interesting idea. We're gonna come back, I think, and address that in a couple different ways, talking about PL/SQL APIs and instead of using triggers. And Toon, I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about that regarding the SmartDB context.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a comment from Kevin Zhang. Oracle's trigger concept is similar to JavaScript's callback function concept. However, Oracle's triggers are always synchronous. And this is another question. JavaScript's callback function is asynchronous, so there's certainly a massive difference there. Triggers are clearly synchronous. They're triggered by an event occurring. Drop a table, add a row, etc. So there's no sense of asynchronous operations with triggers. And then a comment from Eric, much of the new modifications, so the new, these pseudo records available inside triggers, can now be done with improved column defaults in more recent versions of Oracle, like the identity columns. And we're going to see that in a second too. And here's a question, can we find out from $$ active session history or from somewhere else whether a piece of code has been fired from a trigger? Any thoughts on that, fellows?
I'm not sure if you can. I'd have to look into it.
But if then maybe the recursive, is the recurse level captured in that $$ view? I don't know.
Yeah, there is a top level SQL, but I'm not sure exactly what that captures.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to look into it.
I'll need to look into it too.
Okay, I was just looking at my PowerPoint because I seem to have lost a slide somewhere. Okay, let's go back to sharing. Okay, so let's move along. And what I thought we'd do is actually get my PowerPoint going. Right, take a look at a few different triggers, or a couple different triggers. There's one less than I thought at this point. So take a look at this trigger. This is a trigger before insert on one of my tables in the DevGem, DG Workouts table. It's an autonomous transaction trigger in which we update some other table for some reason. We send out an email, commit our changes. Any thoughts, first from the folks attending the session, not our illustrious speakers. Any thoughts on issues with this trigger? I know, Toon, it's kind of a test. Was anybody listening to me? Of course, now nobody's going to want to talk. So Toon, yeah. So breaks rollback, email goes out anyway. So right, correct, Eric. So what we've got a situation here where we can send out the email, but then something goes wrong, and this is not part of the transaction, and the email goes out regardless. Same thing with the update. And as an autonomous transaction, we can actually make changes that are saved irreversibly, even if the overall transaction is rolled back. And as Sven points out, email should never be sent directly from a trigger. Sven, I really must agree with you there. I've published a blog post, and actually there'll be an upcoming Oracle Magazine article about when you're working in Apex, how to put safeguards around your code to avoid spamming people. And I just, given my experience, because I've made a number of mistakes, I can't imagine putting inside a trigger, sending out an email to anybody. Eric says he literally created a framework to make emails transactional for this very reason. Yes. And one comment from Socrates about, I think going back to the question about, can I find out whether or not a piece of code was fired from a trigger? He mentioned that util call stack, or he or she mentioned util call stack. So I think that there are some things you could do to grab runtime information and walk up the stack and see if it passed through a trigger. So I think that should be doable that way. Yes. Now the comments, let's keep going. So this is actually, this trigger here was a lead into a comment or another reflection from Tom Kite around triggers that has to do with trigger restarts. I picked the youngest picture of Tom that I could find. I thought he'd be pleased with that. Who knows, he might be on this call. Hey, Tom. So some of you may not be aware of this. There are a number of blog posts on Tom's blog and also on AskTOM, and there are links on the PL/SQL Office Hours page for this session that will link you up to trigger restarts. So there are conditions under which a before each row trigger might actually fire multiple times. It might start and then have to be restarted. And that's one of the most important reasons that you don't want to have logic like this inside your triggers, because it actually might fire more than once for a single operation on the table. So if you're not familiar with trigger restarts and the potential pitfalls there, check out the links on our session for that. And so what do you do instead? And this introduces the idea, I think, which is in a way a lot of the solution around what do you do with trigger-based architectures? And that is you take your logic out of your triggers as much as you possibly can, and you put them into PL/SQL APIs, and then you restrict access to your table. So the basic idea behind using triggers on tables for things like created by, created on, my primary key generation, is that way anybody does an update or an insert or a delete, they have to trigger the trigger activity, which does the things that you require to be done on a new row in the table, on an update, and so on. But what you can also do is take all that logic out of triggers, put it inside your PL/SQL APIs, revoke privileges from tables directly for developers and users, and force them to go through the PL/SQL API. And I think that also addresses the point that someone raised earlier about ODBC access. In other words, non-normal access to underlying data structures. Toon, any other, and the others, any other comments on that?
Yeah, well, the big picture here is, and you mentioned the SmartDB approach that Bryn Llewellyn and myself have been evangelizing a lot, is that the big picture is that SQL statements should only live inside PL/SQL source code. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there should be no SQL statements coming in from whatever environment outside the database. The only thing that should come in is what you just mentioned, API calls into stored procedures or package stored procedures. And that way you can do what Stephen just said, get all the logic out of those triggers and put them sequentially inside the source code of your PL/SQL API that also has the DML statements that need to be executed.
And can you think of any situation where if you took this approach and you guaranteed that nobody can touch the table, you have to go through the PL/SQL API, is there anything that you could do in triggers that you could not do through this approach, offhand? Anything come to mind?
No, nothing comes to mind. No.
Okay.
You may have a bit of you have to think about this dry concept, this don't repeat yourself concept, mm-hmm. Because the nice thing about a trigger is it's all there on one single spot.
And it's the bottleneck. You have to go through it. You can't miss it.
Yeah, but it always fires for an insert. You may have different APIs that all do an insert inside the same table. Don't repeat the logic surrounding these inserts, but apply the dry principle also mm-hmm. when you design your PL/SQL code base.
So in essence, like you should avoid having multiple places in your PL/SQL where you do inserts into the same table in a similar fashion, right? Maybe just have a PL/SQL procedure to facilitate those inserts. And if you need to use it in several places, just call that procedure rather than writing plain insert statements in different pieces of your PL/SQL APIs or PL/SQL code.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent advice. And Eric says, starting to sound like SmartDB. Well, yes, it does start to sound like SmartDB. And I just want to put out one caution. If you have spent time looking into the SmartDB architecture, Bryn's work on it, it can seem rather daunting. To really do it 100% right is a pretty significant enterprise. But you don't have to do 100% SmartDB to get a lot of the benefits of SmartDB. And putting these PL/SQL APIs around the core activities against that table and restricting as much as is possible or workable for you in terms of access to those underlying tables, you'll gain a lot of the benefits.
Yeah. There's some comments about sending emails generally. So Amma saying should never send an email directly from Apex or a trigger or processing. And personally, something like sending an email, I would always decouple from whatever action initiates it. So if you've got to press a button and as a result that does some stuff and sends an email, I would always log the fact you're going to send the email to a table and then have a completely separate process actually read that table and do the sending. Because there's lots of issues like we've just discussed in that you might get partway through, send the email and have to roll back and double sending. But also I'm sure you've all experienced one way or another, the production database has been refreshed to test and it's got a whole bunch of real customers' emails in it, and someone forgets this and people get emails from their test system. I'm sure you've all seen that one way or another. By kind of decoupling this process, you give yourself a kind of a bit of a buffer. We write to the log, and as long as we don't have the email job running in our test and development environments, you're protected from sending things out. So anywhere, certainly anything you're going to send something external outside of the database, I'd always look to decouple it from triggering, the action that initiates it. Just makes it much easier to debug and resolve if there are any problems.
Which, by the way, Chris is just basically telling me that I need to change the way we do emails at the dev gym. We actually maintain our own email queue, so we can do recovery, but we certainly do send it right out to the Apex email queue. And maybe we'll take a look at more fully decoupling. And there were a couple more comments along those lines about the value of decoupling. And as Joseph points out, isn't a SQL API susceptible to the same issue as a trigger in that once the API sends an email, it can't be rolled back either? That's entirely true. But if we do have this decoupling, so it's always put into a queue, and then a separate process actually does the send, you have some additional control there. Yeah, very helpful. And similar comments from Sven about having a staging table. Yes, email. Tricky and embarrassing. Go ahead.
There's one more thing that comes to my mind when we looked at the previous trigger as opposed to this API that you're showing now, is that in the previous screen, when you look at that trigger, it's actually for each row. So what happens is if you have like an insert as select statement that inserts, let's say, 10,000 rows, what will happen is that this trigger will fire 10,000 times. It means 10 times and 10,000 times going from SQL into PL/SQL and then to the SQL again and to the utLSMTP, right? Whereas in the other implementation that you're showing with the storage procedure, you actually would go and do those statements in bulks just once. So actually you have two updates and one call to utLSMTP.
Great point. Much more control is the bottom line. You get to carefully and hopefully correctly, after automated testing with utPLSQL, get to design exactly what you want to have happen. Yes, no question. Okay, here's let's see, nice big comment from Bill. I would face a major revolt if I made all database usage restricted solely through formal APIs. I have several legacy databases, all as separate schemas now, in my database representing pieces of scientific data going back over 50 years. This is why I created table triggers, so those users could still access the tables and data as they always have, and wouldn't need to redesign their spreadsheets and so on. And I can still track what they've done and revert it if necessary. All my triggers really do, though, is simply a data backup for each row changed. Most of the users of one legacy system access it strictly through ODBC with a variety of applications. Now, again, I think Chris is you're going to address the issue of keeping the changes logged. But Bill, that's a great point. And honestly, anything we talk about here is always going to be factored in, or you have to take into account your real world situation. And it may not be practical to make the changes you're making. What you might think about, though, is we've got all this legacy stuff that has to happen a certain way. For new development, we can at least look at freezing out developers from directly working with tables and only working through the API. So I think the question becomes, what's the best way to do it? And then you say, what's the real way I have to deal with doing it? And it might actually end up being a hybrid solution, and you just do the best you can. And if you have to fall back on triggers, you fall back on triggers. And the more you're aware of the drawbacks of triggers and what you can do to ameliorate those weaknesses, the better off you are. And Chris is going to show everyone an alternative approach to those kinds of auditing triggers. In fact, let's dive into that, seeing as it's already 10:35. So here's another trigger. So now we're creating a trigger after insert or update or delete on employees table. And the basic idea, though I'm obviously showing you very little of it, this comes from a blog post by Connor McDonald, also linked on the SQL Office Hours page. The basic idea behind this is that we want to keep track of the old values and new values for a row when a change is made. So if I'm updating or inserting, I can call those functions inside a trigger to say, then insert into the audit employees table for old and new. If I'm deleting, I only want to see the old values and so on. So Chris, let me hand it off to you.
Okay, cool. So if you go to the next slide, then quite often we talk about auditing in the sense of identifying fraud. So if people have unrestricted or even any kind of access to your database, how do you know who's done what? How do you know if someone's come along and manipulated the data in a way that they weren't supposed to? So some of you may remember a few years ago, there was like the LIBOR exchange rate fixing scandal. It was fairly big here in the UK because there were some London bankers involved. But the idea is some people colluded to manipulate exchange rates, and then they could make some money out of it. So if we go to the next slide, let's imagine some hypothetical world where you've got master access to the exchange rates database table. And I don't think one really exists in the real world, but let's say somehow you manage to find this, and you know, the dollar to the British pound exchange rate is, I'm not sure what it is at the moment. It's getting closer to a dollar to the pound every day. So, but typically it's been like, you know, $1.50 or $2 to the pound, and it's fluctuated between that. What you want to do is, if you're an exchange rate trader, you could temporarily set it to a 1-to-1 exchange rate. And if you, next slide, Stephen,
Sure.
And then, you know, you're a rogue trader, you can just come along and then say, right, sell my, you know, dollars for pounds for 1 million of those. And then if you quickly flip back onto the next slide, you can reset the exchange rate back to what it was. And then if we go on again, then you can sell, you know, buy back your dollars. And then, you know, if you can do that, if you can orchestrate this well enough, then you've just made yourself some free money, right?
Chris, listen, I just have to point out, because Oracle Legal did get in touch before the talk, you need to state officially that Oracle Corporation, either any of its employees, suggests that you do anything like this or anything else that's illegal. Okay.
Yes. I am in no way advocating that you do this, but you know, certainly, you know, several of you either do work or have worked in regulated industries such as finance, where you need to be aware that, you know, there are people out there who try and do things like this. You know, they try and manipulate prices, exchange rates, and so on, so they can kind of make some free money by just taking advantage of some temporary changes in prices, which they've somehow managed to figure out one way or another. And of course, you know, one way we stop people having direct access to the database is a good way to prevent this. But if we go on the next slide, Stephen, you know, the real thing is, you know, we need auditing to kind of identify and resolve these kind of problems, because ultimately there's always going to be someone who has access to the database through their application and are actually authorized to make price changes and that kind of thing. But you need to know who did what, when they did it. So if anyone does something they shouldn't have done, you can go back and track through, see what actually happened. And so this is something several people in the comments have been kind of alluding to. You know, how do we audit? How do we know what's really going on? So we go next slide, Stephen. You know, the classic simple obvious approach a lot of people take is they go, let's just create a whole bunch of triggers on these tables. We just capture the values. So after insert, update, delete, we capture the old values, write them to a table, and then we don't worry about it. And you know, this is one of those kind of seductive ideas because it sounds really simple, but as Toon was saying earlier, it changes the semantics of insert. You're doing something else besides just inserting into one table. But I think for me, the real concern of this approach is you've got these bunch of triggers and you go, right, we're safe, we've audited, we've captured everything. And then what happens? Well, 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the line, pretty much on in the development team, the original development team has moved on. And the new developers are not aware of these triggers, right? You know, if we have this using triggers to audit, then you've created an ongoing burden and maintenance for your development team. Every time you create a new table, every time you alter columns in an existing table, you need to go through and change these triggers. Yes. And this is a step which is very, very easily overlooked. And, you know, I've worked on systems where some of the tables were missing triggers completely, or perhaps more subtly, the triggers were on the tables, but half of the columns were missing from the trigger because someone added some columns, they hadn't fully read the documentation or weren't fully informed of the process and hadn't updated the triggers. So I mean, for me, the real issue here is it creates an ongoing burden of maintenance for the development team, which is often forgotten in the midst of time as people move on from the application. And so the question then becomes, well, how do we capture these changes? How do we audit them? Well, if you go next slide, Stephen. So there is, some of you may well know there's a technology called Flashback. So Flashback query, which you can use to view the changes that were made to a table within a period of time. So here we can say, we're looking at everything that was made between the start of 2018 and today. And we can see all the changes to the table, the whole state, except, if you go click again, Stephen, this is limited by your undo table space, right? So it's, there's several problems with this. Of course, you can only have a limited size undo table space. For us to go back from today to what, over a year and a half ago, your undo table space would have to be absolutely colossal to store all that data, to store all the full history of that. But more importantly, things like restarting the database then loses all that history. So you kind of go, oh, we've got this flashback query, we can see what changes there are, but there's a whole bunch of stuff which then invalidate this undo. So we can then not query back across it. So this sounds nice in practice, but nice in theory, but in practice, it only really helps in short-term scenarios. So, you know, an hour, a day, maybe a week, depending on rate of change and what your DBAs have configured. Luckily, as we've kind of been saying, there is an alternative. So Flashback Data Archive. And what this does is actually create some tables that persist the audit history for your database. So if you go forward quickly, Stephen. So first thing you need to do is create the Flashback archive, and this stores the history. This is an area where you're going to store that audit information, and you can set the retention period. So that could be weeks, months, or years. So you could say 3 months of history, 2 years, whatever it is based on your needs and requirements. And then we go on again, we can then alter the table to use that Flashback archive. So now, whenever you do DML against that, database will capture that for you. So we're getting that auditing without you having to actually write some triggers and potentially forget about them and worry about what the heck's going on. And then if you go to the next one, yeah. So in 12C, one of the neat things about this, we've got these whole bunch of versions pseudo columns, which tell you, you know, is this an insert, update, delete, so operation IUD, the start and end time and SCN and these operations. So you can track back and see the history of what really happened to your tables by who was running DDL. So this was improved in 12C, but if you click again, Stephen, one of the cool things is this was part of an option which had an interesting history and was renamed, I think, a couple of times, was called Total Recall at some point. This was made free from 11.024 if you've got Enterprise Edition. So provided you're on Enterprise Edition, this was part of your license from 11.024, and we improved it quite a bit in 12C. So we go next slide, Stephen, then you can look at some history like this. So you can see these are the changes, and we can see someone in the middle there, they changed the exchange rate from, you know, 0.29 of a pound to a dollar to $1 and then back again. And then you can kind of go, wow, we can see who's done it, when they did it, and try and track down perpetrators if they've gone and messed with our data. And that's what I had to cover on that.
Ah, great. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to stop sharing. We'll turn on everybody's video, and I'll read a couple of comments from the chat.
You can turn on your video, Stephen.
I should turn on my video. Why not? There we go. Yes, there I am. Okay, so let's see. First of all, and this kind of leads back into what you were just talking about. Judith mentioned that one thing that she did was use triggers. Let's see if I can find it. We once used an ad hoc trigger for spy reasons to find out where some unexplainable updates were originating from. So something's going on in my database. I can't figure it out. And the nice thing about the trigger is that you can't avoid it, right? So that's one of the core benefits, and it can be one of the challenges. But so they created a trigger. They could then track to see how they got to that point. And of course, you've got the util various util functions you can call to do that. And that comes back to, there are some other comments, but let's just stay focused on the auditing side of things. You just then followed up with, if you need long-term permanent auditing, Flashback Archive sounds like a good solution. But if you just need to spy on somebody, putting a little trigger like that for a little while might be a better thing to do. And Socrates says, does Flashback Data Archive have information about client program, client OS user, and others? Because in his opinion, Flashback query is different from auditing.
Yeah, so you can capture all that information. So by default, I think it just basically has the operation, the times, and maybe a couple of other things. But pretty much everything out of $V session, so the program, the user, I think basically every column of that can be audited if you enable it. It's not by default, but you can capture all that if you need to.
And is Flashback Data Archiving preferred to standard Oracle auditing?
So they are different things, really. So audit is also about using a feature, like did I run a query? A good example is actually selects. Flashback Data Archive only applies to changes. You might also want to know who actually ran particular queries, who was able to see which information. Flashback doesn't capture that because you're not changing anything in the database. The audit, you can audit select, so you know what queries people have run. So they do serve slightly different purposes.
And Joseph Kerr asks, thoughts on a single audit table with an XML column that triggers write-only whatever changes along with some identifier info, such as application user name, then builds views for history for those particular tables? So a single audit table for everything, I think, is what Joseph is talking about. I have a feeling I know the answer. Use Flashback Data Archive.
Yeah, kind of.
And here's another comment from Joseph Food, moving off of the Flashback Data Archive more to the issue of maintenance nightmare of triggers. I don't really buy the new support staff won't be aware of the triggers argument. Should we stop using views too because support staff may not maintain them when a base table changes? How about indexes? They may be affected by maintenance work too. What if the support staff fail to consider indexes? Shall we turn our application into a simple table-only bit bucket simply because support staff are not properly trained? Well, I know a bunch of people would say yes. It's the support staff's responsibility to know all the functionality components of their application, not just the tables. If they fail to maintain all the components, it's a failure of the support staff, not the triggers and not the developers. Comments?
So, my response is I've personally worked on systems where people are supposed to know this stuff and supposed to have done it and didn't. You know, why exactly is, you know, the various it's lost in the mist of time, but it does happen. It's, you know, you can say, we can sit here with the shoulds, people should do this, people should do that, they should know how this works, but in the real world, development teams do change, and documentation either isn't made or is poorly done, new staff join and are not fully brought up to speed on the process. I think certainly when it comes to auditing, it's not part of the day-to-day functioning of the application. If your auditing doesn't work, you probably won't notice for weeks, months, maybe even years, because it's only if an audit's called or you happen to use it to investigate support issues that you typically actually use it. Things like saying, oh, how about indexes? I think that's kind of a straw man argument. You know, if someone removes some indexes or doesn't create them, performance issues will appear pretty quickly. So I think the main issue with using triggers to do auditing is that you can quite easily go a long period of time without knowing that then you've missed that information, and by the time you find out, it's kind of too late.
Yes,
what I would say is actually, you know, given the example you showed, Chris, with Flashback Data Archive, is, well, if you can make it simple, why not, right? So if you can avoid the complexity of triggers and the maintenance hell, well, why would you give an extra work to the support team or the engineering team that is working on a system? If they don't have to do it, maybe they don't need to.
You know, and Toon, anything from you before I stick my 2 cents in?
Well, I think Joseph does have a point. I mean, maintenance staff is supposed to know all the functionality, all the nuts and bolts and bits and pieces that the whole application comprises of. the thing where I have seen it gone wrong is that everybody can build whatever they want in a team, and the way triggers are used is becoming very rapidly very diverse. And you can actually see these bits of the database design, they were built by that developer, those bits were done by this team. And so triggers, they are a very powerful solution to solve certain issues. But I think there should be some standards and guidelines, at least around them, if you do choose to use them, and make sure that those are aware in the current and future teams working on that application.
I think those are all good points, and my 2 cents would be that just if I generally agree with you that fundamentally you should not avoid using a feature because, well, it could be hard in and of itself. I think what you want to do is figure out, with something like Oracle Database, there are so many different features and tools that you can put to use, and every single one of them can be used and can be abused. And you never generally want to say, don't use that because it can lead to problems. What you want to say, and of course this is the ideal world, is this feature is good for X, Y, and Z. Let's use it here, and let's make sure that people understand how it should be used and how it should not be used. Now, and all of this is quite theoretical, because then you get into the real world and it sort of all falls apart. Like it is said, your plan is good until you get a punch in the mouth, until your app goes production, until your deadline suddenly is half what it was before. But I think you're right that you don't want to veer away from technology just because it can be abused or misused or neglected. All right, let's see what else we got here. There's a comment here from Judith about using DBMS Flashback Archive set context level to capture full information. Judith, you say maybe an enhancement request could be added to allow doing this at table granularity. I'm sorry, I lost context. What at table granularity? And a question from Adika. What happens with the audit with Flashback Data Archive, but at the same time that table is also applied or part of VPD or real application security settings? How can we assure that the DBAs can't see the values changing in the table? So the issue of security, right? We're putting data in the audit that may need to be redacted or not available to people.
As always, I think when it comes to the changes themselves, whatever VPD or policies you've got in place, whatever inserts or updates actually happen to the table, Flashback or will capture those. In terms of who can actually query them, that's probably a bigger question, because you've got to look at who's got access, what access they've got, and that's where we're talking about audit of queries. You want to look at who, because ultimately, usually there has to be at least a group of people who have some kind of system, sysdba access, who in theory could do anything. How do you audit what they do? And there's always the thing, but anyone who's got physical access to the box, in theory, can do anything. So.
Dennis asks, one question regarding triggers, but not related to auditing using ad hoc triggers, which I found a very far-fetched case. The official docs state that one of the popular use cases for triggers is for auto-generating virtual column values. When exactly could and should they be used for this case? Because for me, it is not quite clear.
That bit in the documentation is not clear for me either. a virtual column is defined exactly by its expression.
Do you think they mean invisible column? Maybe invisible? That would make more sense, right?
Maybe it's just about the calculated column. But then why wouldn't you just calculate it in the SQL itself?
Right.
Oh, maybe going back to the question of using PLSQL APIs, right? If you don't have PLSQL APIs, you want to have a column that's always calculated and stored in the database. So you would assure this calculation to be done properly based on a table trigger. Maybe that's a good case, actually, if you would go with this design and not use virtual columns.
I'm going to check with the doc team and find out if maybe it shouldn't be saying that. Because I figure if people on this call, especially Tone, are puzzled by something in the doc, there's probably something wrong with the doc one way or the other. If deciding to use triggers, it is important that this usage be controlled by overall application designers and not just left to be used freely by any developer. Great comment, Judith, and that was something that I think Toon had mentioned before about you have to have some standards. People have to be trained on these features, and there should be guidelines about how to use them. Okay, an enhancement request from Sven. That new :new.row and :old.row inside a row trigger will, yes, that would be really nice. It would be nice to treat those pseudo records as real records. Certainly, it's been on the list of enhancement in the PL/SQL team for maybe as long as SQL assertions. I don't know, maybe longer, but I can't not give you any update about when that might show up. Judith, auto-generating virtual columns is one of the least harmful usages, but not necessarily anymore since 11G. Okay, any other wonderful speakers who helped make this a very entertaining and educational experience before we shut down? They've said it all. Any other final comments in chat? All right. Thank you all for joining us. Hopefully you found it interesting and educational. We'll be posting the video within the next day or two. You'll have links to all the resources on the AskTOM Office Hours page, and look forward to seeing you on our next session. Have a great end of summer. I guess no, have a great fall. I guess summer's over. Take care, everybody. Happy coding.
Take care.
Thank you.